see it on this image and you can't see it on your models, but I'll ask you about it, probably, again, on your practical. But there would be a piece of membranous tissue that would cover the opening of the vaginal canal, and that's called the hymen. Okay? Now, for girls, especially athletic, girls, that often gets broken, even without sexual intercourse. That often will break. Gymnastics, that often will tend to break. Just certain kinds of athletics, that will just break with time. But if it is intact upon first intercourse, when that breaks, it often will cause some bleeding. Sometimes a little bit, sometimes it's a lot. So that's the hymen right there. If we look up here, this is the uterus. The neck of the uterus here, this would be the cervix. And then coming off of the lateral sides of the uterus, and again, we'll see this better on another image, you have the fallopian tubes here. So here's one, and there would be one coming off of the other lateral side. At the kind of end of the fallopian tube, you've got these finger-like extensions. Those are called fimbriae. Okay, and again, we'll see that better on another image. The fimbriae kind of wrap around but do not touch the ovary. So there's an ovary on each side. So essentially the ovary would be like this and the fimbriae would wrap around it like this, but they do not touch. On your models and on these images, it looks like there's physical connection, but there's not. About 12 to 24 hours, I think it's about 24 hours prior to ovulation, the cilia that are on the apical surface of the cells that make up the fimbriae, that cilia starts beating. And that beating of the cilia plus some other mechanisms is what's going to help that ovulated oocyte that comes off of the ovary. That's what's going to help to sweep it up into the fallopian tube. It could theoretically, and it happens, the ovulated oocyte could end up out here in the abdominal pelvic cavity. And if it does, it'll just get broken down and the components reabsorbed. But you want it swept up into the fallopian tube, and the cilia plus some other mechanisms helps it to get swept up into the fallopian tube. And again, we'll talk more about that in a little bit. We'll talk about the connective tissues here very shortly. Okay, so looking at this coronal cut here, okay? This section is going to be focusing, this first kind of part of the lecture is going to focus on the ovaries. We're going to talk about how you make ovum, and then we'll talk about the ovarian cycle. And then once we do that, then we'll talk about the uterus, and we'll talk about the uterine cycle. And then we'll say a few other odds and ends, and that'll pretty much be the lecture. There's a lot to it, but that's pretty much where we're going today. Okay, so when we look here, this would be the vaginal canal or the vagina. Cervix is the neck of the uterus that extends down into the vagina. This would be the uterus right here, hollow organ. Coming off lateral of the uterus, you've got a fallopian tube and another fallopian tube. Fallopian tubes are also called uterine tubes, also called oviducts. Again, at the ends of those fallopian tubes, you have these finger-like extensions. Those are your fimbriae. The fimbriae then wrap around or drape over. That's a better way of thinking of it. They drape over the ovary. This ovary here is a coronal cut, so we're looking inside of it. Now, let's talk about some connective tissues that help to hold the ovaries in place. When we talk about the uterus, we'll talk about some connective tissues that help to hold the uterus in place. So, for the ovaries, again, the ovaries aren't actually attached to any other organ. Okay? They're not physically attached to the fallopian tube. They're not physically or directly, I should say, attached to the uterus. So they're held in place through these connective tissues. One, the broad ligament. This is the biggest of the connective tissues. It's a flat connective tissue, and it essentially wraps around everything. Okay? It goes around the uterus, It goes around the fallopian tubes, it goes around the ovaries, and then it anchors into the, connective tissue that lines the abdominal pelvic cavity, the peritoneum. So it anchors into the peritoneum that lines the abdominal pelvic cavity. So that's essentially going around everything. And I kind of think of it almost like saran wrap, right? It's just kind of wrapping around everything to help hold everything in place. Now, you have what's called the mesovarium. The mesovarium is, the way I think about the mesovarium, I think it's kind of like a subdivision of the broad ligament that just kind of wraps around a few more times right around the ovary. So the mesovarium, again, is kind of part of the broad ligament that just wraps around the ovary a few more times. So the mesovarium would be this area right here, wrapping around the ovary. Then you've got these two ligaments that are more kind of traditionally, what do you think of ligaments like? Like we saw holding bones to bones, ligaments kind of like that, kind of like a rope. That would be your ovarian ligament and your suspensory ligament. So the ovarian ligament is coming off of the lateral side of the uterus and it anchors to the medial side of your ovary. Now, I will absolutely ask you that on your practical, okay? Because it's one of the few connective tissues you can actually see on the models. And I ask you to make sure that you don't confuse it with the fallopian tubes. So I'll ask you to identify the fallopian tubes and I'll ask you to identify the ovarian ligament. Okay, that'll be up in the lab that I ask you to do that. So again, the ovarian ligament comes off of the lateral side of the uterus, medial side of the ovary. Then you have the suspensory ligament. You can't see that one on your models. And it's even hard to see on images. But the suspensory ligament is going to come off of the lateral side of the ovary and anchor into the abdominal pelvic wall. So it would be coming off back here. Okay. So back here. And around that suspensory ligament is where you would have your ovarian artery and vein. So that's, they're all right beside one another. Okay. So then, we're going to start talking about how you make ovum. How do you make ovum? The process of making ovum, or gametes, female gametes, is oogenesis. Now, we're going to see that the basic template of this process is like we saw with males. We're going to start with a diploid cell. We'll put the names in a minute. That diploid cell is going to undergo mitosis. We're going to end up with two identical diploid daughter cells. And then these diploid daughter cells are going to undergo meiosis. We're going to do meiosis 1. And at the end of meiosis 1, so actually before I draw this, remember last time I said that when we go to make sperm, part of the process of making sperm is to get rid of most of the organelles and most of the cytoplasm so that we end up with a really small kind of aerodynamic cell. I also said that when we go to make female gametes, we have to compensate for that. The female gamete has to, one, we want to end up with one female gamete a month, and we want that one cell to be really big to compensate for the fact that if there's fertilization, the sperm are only bringing 23 chromosomes and really no cytoplasm to speak of and no organelles to speak of. And how we're going to do that is we're going to see at the end of meiosis 1, we are going to have unequal distribution of the cytoplasm. Okay? So when you do, if you remember these terms, when you do cytokinesis, if you remember that word, it's not going to be equal. Okay? Normally, we split the cell equally, and that's how we end up with two identical sized cells. but at the end of meiosis one, it's unequal distribution. So what we're gonna end up with is one really small haploid cell, and all that cytoplasm and organelles goes to a large, maybe not quite that big, let me make it not quite so large yet. One really large haploid cell. And then when we go to do meiosis 2, the last part of meiosis, again, we're gonna end up with unequal distribution of cytoplasm. So again, we're gonna end up with one really small haploid cell and one really huge haploid gamete. Now, this little cell here at the end of meiosis 1, it may or may not go through meiosis 2. It just kind of depends. If it does go through meiosis 2, then it's going to end up with just two really small haploid cells. And whether it goes through meiosis 2 or not, those cells will eventually die off. They're just too small, okay? They're going to end up dying off. So I'm not going to draw it going through meiosis 2, but it could, okay? What I'm going to do is I'm going to put an X through that little cell, and that little cell is called a polar body, because it will die off eventually. It'll either die off at the end of meiosis 1, or it will do meiosis 2, and the resultant polar bodies will die off. Okay, now, when we go to talk about, and we're gonna put in the names of these cells here very shortly. When we go to talk about oogenesis, what we're gonna see is that this is not gonna be a continuous process like it was with males. For males, this process started at puberty, and it just pretty much is always happening, okay? And for males, once you started a cell undergoing, a sperm cell undergoing mitosis, by the time that you actually got spermatozoas from that stem cell that started mitosis, it took you about 9 weeks, okay? But it was a continuous process, like things just kept happening. Not for females. For females, we're gonna start it, and then we're gonna stop it. And we're gonna start it, and it's gonna get halted. So we're gonna have to start and stop a couple times. Because we have to start and stop, we wanna think about the phases of meiosis, 1 and 2. Now, I'm not gonna make you guys relearn what the chromosomes are doing in those phases, okay? I just am gonna put up here the phases so you can hopefully recall, and if not, just see the orders of those phases so that you have a sense of where in this process we're halting and where we're picking back up. So when you look at meiosis, meiosis consists of prophase 1, metaphase 1, anaphase 1, telophase 1, and then that is where you now get the splitting of all the cytoplasm is after telophase 1. And then you go right into meiosis 2, which would be prophase 2, metaphase 2, anaphase 2, and telophase 2. So that's meiosis, meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. Those are the phases. Okay? And again, it has to do with what the chromosomes are doing. Now, the other thing that we have to think about is the fact that when we look at these cells undergoing cell division, there actually are going to be other cells around these cells. And these cells are going to be located within a group of cells called a follicle. Okay? So a follicle. A follicle is going to be, these cells are going to be inside of a follicle. And we're going to talk about follicles in a minute. Okay, so what we're going to do first is just look and see what happens in terms of cell division of these cells to get a gamete. That's what we're gonna look at first, oogenesis. And once we do this, then we're going to kind of back up. And so what we're gonna do first is this right here, that's that cell division, and we're gonna end up with an ovum, and then these little polar bodies that will eventually die off. Once we talk about this and name these cells and talk about when all this happens, then we're gonna talk about the follicles that these cells are inside of and how the follicles are maturing during these cycles, okay, during this ovarian cycle. Once we do that, once we understand how the cells divide and then how the follicle that these cells are inside of, how they grow, then we're going to kind of pull back again and we're going to think about how all this is triggered. What are the hormones that drives this cycle to cause this to happen? Okay, we're going to map out the ovarian cycle, which will be taking these two things into account plus adding hormones into it, okay? And then once we get through that cycle, then we'll move on and talk about the uterus, and then we'll talk about the uterine cycle and pair these two cycles up because they're dependent on one another. So when I first learned this in school, I found it so confusing, okay? So confusing. But I feel like if we go through it in a very methodical way, it doesn't need to be confusing. You're gonna need to review it multiple times, but we're gonna walk through it as methodically as I can possibly make it. And along the way, if you're getting confused, you stop and ask me a question, okay? Or just say, can you repeat that? I'm confused, okay? And we're gonna get through this and you're gonna learn it well, okay? All right, so let's come back. No, I'm gonna leave that up. So, first of all, when does all this happen, okay? This process of oogenesis is gonna start in utero. So that means before the female is ever born, this is happening, okay? This is happening in the female's ovaries while the female is still in the womb, okay, in utero. This first cell here, this first diploid cell, is called an egg stem cell, okay? An egg stem cell. And officially it's called an oogonium, okay? Oogonia for plural, oogonium singular. Just like with the males, it was a spermatogonium, okay? Same basic terminology here. So this is an oogonium. So that is in utero, in the ovaries, these oogonium or oogonias are going to undergo mitosis. And what we're gonna get are diploid daughter cells that are identical to that original parent cell, that oogonium. And these cells are called primary oocytes. Now, for females, we don't have to constantly keep this process going like we did with males. For males, this started at puberty and then continued throughout the life of the male. For females, that is not something that we need to deal with. For females, we don't need to constantly have a group of egg stem cells sitting around to be constantly doing this. So for males, everything that was produced when that sperm stem cell underwent mitosis, half of everything that was produced stayed up at the basal lamina of the seminiferous tubule to become the new round of stem cells. And half of what was produced underwent meiosis. But for females, we don't need to do that. So that means everything we get from this oogonia undergoing mitosis and yielding two primary oocytes, all of these primary oocytes will start meiosis, okay? We're only doing this mitosis of oogenesis in utero. That's the only time we do it, okay? We're not gonna do it any other time, so we don't need to always keep egg stem cells around. So in utero, in the ovaries in utero, these primary oocytes start meiosis I. So these guys I'll put here are primary oocytes. Again, this is in utero where this is happening. In the ovaries in utero, all those cells start meiosis I, but they don't get very far, okay? They're gonna get halted at prophase I, okay? That's as far as they get, and then boom, they stop. So, this gets halted at prophase I. So, what females are born with are not any oogoniums, because while we were in utero, all of our oogoniums underwent mitosis to yield primary oocytes. Then, our primary oocytes started meiosis I, and they all got halted at prophase I. That's what females are born with, right? Females are born with primary oocytes halted at prophase I. We're not born with any of these cells that are downstream because we haven't finished meiosis I yet, okay? So that's what females are born with, okay? So I'll put up here. So we're born with primary oocytes that are halted at prophase. Now, basically nothing's gonna happen during childhood, except a bunch of these are gonna die off, okay? A bunch will die. But we still are halted at prophase I, all through childhood, okay? And then, when puberty kicks in, we're gonna start every month from puberty until menopause. Unless we have a pregnancy, then we won't do this in a given month. Or some other clinical conditions, stress, loss of a lot of weight, certain disease states. But for the most part, from puberty until menopause, every month we're going to go through what's called the ovarian cycle. Okay? So what's going to happen in an ovarian cycle, right, is we are going to have primary oocytes, not all of them, okay? We're going to end up every month from puberty until menopause, we're going to end up with one primary oocyte halted at prophase I is going to continue meiosis I. Okay? Every month from puberty until menopause, there should be one primary oocyte halted at prophase I that continues where it left off. So I'm going to put here, I'm going to put Q month, that means every Q month from puberty until menopause. We're going to have one primary oocyte that's halted at prophase I is going to continue with meiosis I. And what happens when this primary oocyte halted at prophase I, when it completes meiosis I, what we end up with is a small haploid polar body that will die either right away or soon, and a large haploid secondary oocyte. And that secondary oocyte is going to start meiosis II. And it's going to only get partway through meiosis II, and it's going to get halted. It's going to get halted at metaphase II. So the farthest that this can get in that month is metaphase II. So this is going to be halted at metaphase II. Okay, so I'm going to just fill this in. I'm going to say every month from puberty until menopause, a primary oocyte halted at prophase I will continue with meiosis I, getting to a secondary oocyte that's halted at metaphase 2. And that's as far as we can get at this point, okay? And this is what gets ovulated. This is the cell that gets ovulated, not a gamete yet. We don't have a gamete yet. This is our gamete. We're not here yet. We have to finish meiosis 2 to have a gamete. We don't have it yet. So this is the cell that gets ovulated in that month, this cell. So this is going to be ovulated. Okay, so what does ovulated mean? Ovulated just means that this cell, this secondary oocyte that's halted at metaphase 2, is going to burst out of a follicle. Okay, now we're going to talk about follicles in a minute. On the surface of the, in the ovary, but by the surface, there are going to be follicles with these cells inside of them. And what we're going to see is come mid-month of a cycle, we're going to have one perfect-sized, what's called a tertiary follicle. We'll get to that in a minute. Come mid-month, we're going to have one perfect tertiary follicle that is going to be just the right size at mid-month, is going to receive certain hormones that we'll talk about in a minute, and it's going to rupture. And out of that ruptured tertiary follicle is going to come a secondary oocyte halted at metaphase 2 that gets ovulated into the fallopian tube. Okay? So this secondary oocyte halted at metaphase 2, we'll just say, is ovulated into the fallopian tube. And again, we're going to talk about the hormones and all that stuff here in a minute. Okay. So, every month from puberty until menopause, minus certain months we're pregnant, on birth control, real stress possibly, certain disease states, loss of a lot of weight and fat can stop these cycles, but for the most part, every month from puberty to menopause, we're going to have one primary oocyte halted at prophase 1, is going to finish meiosis 2, yielding a secondary oocyte and a small polar body. They're both haploid. The polar body will die off at some point. The secondary oocyte will then continue into meiosis 2, but as far as it can get is metaphase 2. Come mid-cycle, we're going to have this perfect-sized tertiary follicle is going to rupture under the influence of hormones, and out of that perfect-sized tertiary follicle is going to come the secondary oocyte halted at metaphase 2. It will be ovulated, meaning it comes out of that ruptured tertiary follicle and is swept up into the fallopian tube. How well?
I don't understand, like, the halted. What do you mean by halted?
Just stops. It stops right there. Can't go any further. It stops.
Okay.
Right? So it's undergoing mitosis, it's undergoing meiosis, and as far as it can get is here. Then it has to stop. Can't go any further.
Okay.
And then every month from puberty until menopause, it picks up where it left off and finishes meiosis 1, and then starts meiosis 2, and as far as it can get is right there. Then it's stopped, halted, stops. And that's all hormonally driven, okay? And there's some genetic gene regulation that causes it to stop dividing. Stops right there. Okay. Anything else? Okay. All right, so then what we now have is we've got this secondary oocyte that's stopped or halted at metaphase 2, kind of in the middle of meiosis 2. It is now in the fallopian tube, okay? But we don't have a gamete yet, okay? The way we get a gamete, and the only way that we can get a gamete, is if fertilization happens. So let's say if our secondary oocyte, if our ovulated, meaning it's not in the ovary anymore, it's now in the fallopian tube, okay? If our ovulated secondary oocyte that's halted at metaphase 2, if it gets fertilized, is fertilized, right? Obviously that's by a sperm cell, by a spermatozoa. If that happens, then our secondary oocyte, it's halted at metaphase 2, will complete meiosis 2. And when that cell completes meiosis 2, that's when we get a gamete. That's when we get a haploid ovum and a haploid polar body. So this right here is an ovum. And remember, at this point, the sperm cell's inside of it, right? Sperm cell is inside of it because it's inside of this cell. And when this cell went to divide, most of its cytoplasm ended up here, right? And that's where the sperm cell is. And this cell will die off, like a polar body. Now, is it possible the sperm cell could end up in there? Yeah, but it's unlikely. Just because there's not much room in that cell. It's really small. There's not a whole lot of cytoplasm in it. Chances are high the sperm cell's gonna end up in this cell. So, I think there's a big misconception that when the egg gets fertilized, that's when you have a zygote, and it's not. We don't have a zygote yet, okay? All we have right now are 2 haploid cells. The sperm cell has fertilized that secondary oocyte halted at metaphase 2, and now we have a gamete. So our sperm cell is a gamete, our ovum is a gamete, and now that we have a gamete, now, at this point, now the chromosomes of the 2 gametes, so that would be the sperm and the ovum, now those chromosomes can mix. And now we have a zygote, a 2N zygote. 23 chromosomes of the sperm, 23 chromosomes of that ovum. Now they mix to yield the first cell of a new organism, the zygote. And that zygote is diploid. It's got 23 from dad, 23 from mom, 2 times 23, 46 chromosomes. And that zygote is in the fallopian tubes, right? That's where fertilization happened, in the fallopian tubes, and that zygote will immediately start undergoing mitosis. And it will just be dividing. The zygote will divide and produce 2 daughter cells that are both diploid. Then those 2 daughter cells will divide under mitosis and produce their own 2 daughter cells. That's all happening in the fallopian tubes. All right, but let's say fertilization doesn't happen, okay? What happens if there is no fertilization? So we'll say if there's no fertilization, if that ovulated secondary oocyte halted at metaphase 2, if it doesn't get fertilized by a spermatozoa, then we never complete, actually let me say this, we'll say then that secondary, that ovulated secondary oocyte that's halted at metaphase 2 will never complete meiosis 2, and that means we don't get a gamete that month. We ovulated a cell, we just don't get a gamete that month, okay? Which means there's no pregnancy that month. If that ovulated cell is not fertilized, we're done. We're done that month, okay? That secondary oocyte that's halted at metaphase 2 will just break down and its base components reabsorbed, okay? So we'll say secondary oocyte that's halted at metaphase 2 will just get one of two things will happen. So it will either get broken down, and the components reabsorb. So the proteins will get broken down into amino acids and they'll get reabsorbed back in the body. Starch will get broken down into glucose and get reabsorbed by the body. Fats will get broken down into fatty acids and get reabsorbed by the body. That can happen, or it will end up in the uterus. It'll end up traveling through the fallopian tubes to the uterus and get sloughed off during menses. Okay, so let me explain what I mean by that. So we're going to talk about the menstrual cycle in a minute. That's the uterine cycle. And sloughed off just means the lining of the uterus comes off of the innermost part of the uterus, breaks free of the uterus, and then it comes out as a period, as the menstrual cycle. And so that egg might just end up coming out in the period, right, in the blood. Maybe your blood clot even, okay? It'll either get broken down or it'll just slough out like the rest of the tissue will from the uterus. And again, it's just a cell, right? It's just a cell that never got fertilized. Okay? There's nothing special about that cell in that sense. Right? Never got fertilized, it's just a haploid cell, okay? That's sitting in between, sitting in a state of incomplete meiosis. That's all it is. Okay. Take a second and see if you have questions on that, because what we're going to do next is talk about these follicles. Talk about the follicles. I'm going to erase that stuff in a minute, so if you need to take a picture of that head. Before we move on, let me just say a couple things about twins or multiple fertilizations. So there are, let's just talk about twins, okay? So you can have fraternal twins or you can have identical twins. A fraternal twin would be where instead of just ovulating one secondary oocyte halted at metaphase 2 in a given month, you would ovulate 2 secondary oocytes halted at metaphase 2. Okay, that would lead to fraternal twins. If you're talking about triplets, then you would be ovulating 3 secondary oocytes halted at metaphase 2. And just go up from there, okay? You could have one ovary ovulating one and the other ovary ovulating another, and then you have secondary oocytes held at metaphase 2 in different fallopian tubes. That could happen. They could be from the same ovary in the same fallopian tube. And depending on the time of intercourse, potentially you could end up having 2 babies from 2 different fathers. Okay, that could happen. Okay, a little messy, but that could happen. Okay, once a secondary oocyte halted at metaphase 2 is ovulated, it's viable for about a day. Sperm, once they get in the fallopian tube, are viable for about 3 days. So you could have sex, let's say on Monday, and those sperm could be in there, in the fallopian tubes, if they made it up to that point. And then let's say you ovulated on Tuesday, those sperm would definitely still be viable. They might fertilize an egg. And then if you had sex on Tuesday or Wednesday, you could fertilize the other egg, potentially. So that could certainly happen, okay? okay? I'm sure it has. I'm sure it has, okay? But that's a fraternal pregnancy. Identical pregnancy, you ovulate one secondary oocyte halted at metaphase 2, and then after you have a zygote, as that zygote is dividing and producing 2 daughter cells, and then those 2 daughter cells are dividing and producing their own 2 daughter cells, in that process, you end up with the cells, you end up with these groups of cells splitting. So then you have identical twins. There, the DNA is all the same. That's why identical twins look identical, because they all are operating off of this DNA. Whereas fraternal twins, you've got this DNA, another secondary oocyte halted at metaphase 2, that DNA, and 2 separate sperms. So different DNA. Identical twins, it's all off of this DNA right here. Okay. All right. Okay. Questions on any of that stuff? I'm gonna erase it. We're gonna talk about follicles.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just making sure, so prophase 1 happens at mitosis, and then the metaphase 2 is at the meiosis 2?
They're all meiosis. Yeah, this is mitosis.
Okay.
So meiosis is all this. It's just kind of divided into 2 parts, meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. So prophase 1 is part of here, meiosis 1, and then metaphase 2 is in here during meiosis 2, but it's all meiosis.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. When you talk about phases of mitosis, you just call it prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase with some number after it. Okay, I'm gonna erase. All right. Okay, so now let's talk about these follicles. What is a follicle, and how do you get a follicle to rupture mid-cycle? Okay. So remember when we talked about the thyroid gland, and we looked at a thyroid follicle? It's kind of the same basic thing. It's a ring of epithelial cells is what a follicle is. Or at least that's what it starts as. Just a single ring of epithelial cells is what a follicle starts as. Now, it will become much more complex, because that's where we start. So, when we look at follicles, okay? So, we start with what are called primordial follicles. Okay, a primordial follicle is a single layer of squamous epithelium. Or we could just say a ring of simple squamous epithelia with a primary oocyte halted at prophase 1 inside of it. That's a primordial follicle. Technically, that's what we're born with. Okay, so let's draw it. So you got a single layer of simple squamous epithelia. Okay, there's your layer of simple squamous epithelia. And inside of it, we're going to put a primary oocyte halted at prophase 1. That's what a primordial follicle is, okay? And that's what females are born with, okay? That's what females are born with. So you're not just born with a bunch of primary oocytes halted at prophase 1. They've got this layer of cells around them, okay? So this is what females are born with. And these would be in the ovary, So we're going to talk about that follicles can mature into what are called primary follicles and secondary follicles and tertiary follicles. We'll get there in just a second. Females are not born with any of those. And I'm going to ask you that, on your practical or the lecture exam, probably practical. So females are not born with secondary follicles. Sorry, they're not born with primary follicles. They're not born with secondary follicles. They're not born with tertiary follicles. Females are not born with oogonias they're not born with secondary oocytes, they're not born with ovum. What females are born with are primordial follicles, and inside of that, part of that primordial follicle is a primary oocyte halted at prophase 1. Every primordial follicle has a primary oocyte halted at prophase 1 inside of it. That's what females are born with, a whole bunch of them. I don't remember numbers, like millions of them. Okay, there's a lot. And during childhood, nothing happens to these things. They're just sitting there, except a bunch will die off. So during childhood, a bunch of those primordial follicles with the primary oocyte halted at prophase 1 inside of them will die off. And that's just normal kind of cell death for these groups of cells. Okay? And then what's going to happen every month from puberty until menopause. Now, we're focusing right now on the follicles, okay? We're focusing on what the follicles are doing, okay? Every month from puberty until menopause, what's gonna happen is you're gonna have a group of, not all of, a group of, I think it's like about 20 or so, okay? I'll double check, and it's probably in the PowerPoint. I'm blanking on the numbers, but a group of primordial follicles, about 20, something like that, maybe a little less. Let's call it 20, okay? A group of primordial follicles will start to develop, start developing. Or we could say start maturing. Okay, and that's gonna be under the influence of, take a guess what hormone causes that one. Follicle stimulating hormone, okay? That's what's gonna drive this, okay? So every month from puberty until menopause, we're gonna get a rise in FSH, and that's gonna cause a group of primordial follicles to start to mature. Okay, so let's say that we're in our very first cycle, okay? So that means we've got a group of primordial follicles, and I always say they step up to the plate, right? That's how I always word it. They step up to the plate, and they're gonna start to mature, okay? And what they mature into is they mature into primary follicles. And we'll talk about what this looks like in just a second. And then a primary follicle can mature into what's called a secondary follicle, and we'll talk about what that looks like in just a second. And then a secondary follicle can mature into a tertiary follicle. You'll also see tertiary follicles called mature follicles. You'll also see them called Graafian follicles. Remember, it's 2 A's or 2 F's? 2 A's. Graafian follicles. Okay. And again, I'll say what these look like in just a second. But what's gonna happen is, you're gonna end up with the perfect size tertiary follicle come mid-cycle, and that's the one that's going to rupture, okay? And out of it will come a secondary oocyte halted at metaphase 2, okay? Let me say it one more time. So primordial follicles can mature into primaries, primaries can mature into secondaries, secondaries can mature into tertiaries, also called mature or Graafian follicles. And every month, what we should end up with is one perfect sized tertiary follicle that will be just right on day 14, mid-cycle. That's assuming a 28-day cycle. We'll talk about that in a minute. That will be the one that ruptures. There might be some tertiary follicles that are just a little bit too immature come mid-cycle, and they can't rupture that month. There might be some that would have been the perfect size, but 2 days earlier, and by day 14, they're overripe, and they will just die off, okay? Now, let me say a few more things about this. You cannot go from a primordial to a tertiary in 1 month. You can't do it in 1, 2, 3, 4. You can't do it in 4 months. This takes about 9 months to a year to get from here, a primordial, to here, tertiary, okay? okay? It takes about 9 months to a year. So what's going on, okay? So let's think about some multiple cycles and how this works, and then I'll come back and talk about what these look like. So let's say it's the very first cycle that a female ever has, okay? So in that very first cycle, about 20 primordials will step up to the plate, they'll receive FSH, and they will start maturing. And they will get as far as they can come mid-cycle, and then they stop that maturation process, they stop. And it's somewhere in between here. They haven't even got to a primary yet, but they're just maturing as far as they can, and come mid-cycle, when hormone levels change, they stop maturing, okay? And then they just sit there, okay? And then the next month, let's say month 2, okay? Month 2, those primordial follicles from the previous month, they just pick up wherever they left off. Let's say it was here. They pick up wherever they left off when FSH levels rise, and they just keep maturing. And they'll get as far as they can in that cycle, come mid-cycle, and then they stop. Also in that second month, we'll get a brand new group of 20 primordials that will step up to the plate, and they will start maturing. And again, all those follicles, 20 from the previous month, the first month, the new 20 from the second month, they just get as far as they can until hormone levels change and they have to stop dividing. They stop maturing. And then the third month comes. Again, FSH levels rise. The group from the very first month, they pick up wherever they left off and they keep maturing. The group from the second month, they pick up wherever they left off and keep maturing. And in that third month, we have a brand new set of 20 that step up to the plate and they start maturing. And that just happens every month that we have a cycle. That happens until finally, by about 9 months or a year, we will end up with one perfect tertiary follicle come mid-cycle and it will rupture, okay? We're gonna end up with a bunch of them that are overripe come mid-cycle and they just die. Any that are just a little bit too young come mid-cycle, they just stop, and the next month they pick up wherever they left off, and they will probably be overripe come mid-cycle the next month. And by doing this every month, once you get about 9 months or a year into it, then every month you should have a perfect tertiary follicle that will rupture every month, okay? Most of these are gonna die, okay? Most will die because they will be overripe come mid-cycle of a particular month, and they'll just die off. But there will be one, perfect one, and that's the one that will rupture, and out of it will come a secondary oocyte halted at metaphase 2. Okay. Questions on that before we look and see what these look like? Okay, all right, so let's see what these guys look like. So, let's do it in a real general sense and then we'll get into some details. Basically, when these follicles, when a primordial follicle receives FSH, just meaning FSH binds to receptors on those primordial follicular cells, those cells will start dividing and differentiating. They're epithelial cells. They're geared to divide anyway, right? So they just start dividing and differentiating. And what you end up with is more layers of cells. A primary follicle is bigger than a primordial. A secondary is bigger than a primary, is bigger than a primordial. And a tertiary is a lot bigger than a secondary, primary, or primordial. You get more and more layers of cells, right? More and more layers of cells. Let's put that here. More layers of cells. And the cells are more specialized. We don't just have layers of epithelial cells, we have specialized cells now. And there are 2 types of cells I want you guys to know. Okay, 2 types of specialized cells that I want you to know. Let me put this slide up here so you can see where it is. Okay. Fecal and granulosal cells. Okay? Those are 2 subtypes that you see in primary, secondary, and tertiaries, but not primordials. Okay? So, we'll say, for example, fecal and granulosal cells. Now, we're keeping this pretty general, but what I want you to know is they will secrete estrogen. So that means if I ask you, do primordial follicles secrete estrogen? What will you tell me? Do primordials secrete estrogen? No, because all they are simple squamous epithelial cells with a oocyte inside of it. But once we have primordials maturing into primaries, secondaries, tertiaries, if we're in that first part of the cycle when FSH levels are high, and we'll look at this in a second, then we'll see those follicles, these follicles that are in the first part of our cycle where FSH is high, they are secreting estrogen. Okay, they're secreting estrogen. Okay. All right, questions on any of that? We're gonna now map out the cycle. We're gonna do a timeline. We're gonna put phases in it. We're gonna say what hormones are triggering what. We're gonna kind of pull it all together. Okay. Let me find a good slide to put up here. I'm gonna put this slide up here. It's talking about the middle of the cycle and the last part of the cycle, but we'll put the whole thing out here. No, actually, you know what? I'm gonna go towards the end of this PowerPoint. And I'm gonna put this up there. So what we're gonna do right now is we're gonna do this ovarian cycle. That's this one, okay? This is the uterine cycle. We'll do that next. We're gonna do the ovarian cycle, and we're gonna be looking at these hormones, FSH and LH, the gonadotropins that come from the anterior pituitary. They drive this cycle, or they drive that cycle. Okay, so let's do it. So when I go to do cycles, again, to keep myself from getting confused, I always review, I always learn and then review my cycles always in the same way every single time. And that is, we're gonna map out a timeline, we're gonna put in the phases, we're gonna do a brief description of those phases, we're gonna say what triggers that phase, is it, what hormone triggers the phase, is it an increase or decrease in that hormone that triggers the phase, and what do we get from that phase? We do that every single time. By doing that multiple times, you should get this in your head pretty well. On your final, one of these cycles, so we're gonna talk about two, the ovarian and the uterine. One of them, I'm gonna have you fill out a table, kind of like you filled out a table for activating CD4 and CD8 cells, okay? So I'm telling you right now, I absolutely am gonna have you fill out a table for one of these cycles, right? I'll say, what's this phase called on days blah, blah, blah? What happens during this phase? What hormone triggers this phase? Is it an increase or decrease? Okay, absolutely, you're gonna have one table on there you fill out. It's gonna be worth a lot of points, 6 to 8 points, okay, it's a lot. And then the other one that I don't have you fill out a table, that will be multiple choice questions. All right, so we're gonna do the ovarian cycle. The ovarian cycle is what happens in the ovaries, okay? The ovarian cycle happens in the ovaries. Okay, we're gonna map out a timeline. We're gonna use a 28-day cycle, which is pretty standard, okay? Some females have a longer cycle, some have a shorter cycle, and we'll see which part of the cycle can be shorter or longer. One part can't change by much, but the other part can change. We're gonna put right in the middle, day 14, okay, in the cycle. Okay, so you map out your timeline, then we're gonna put in the phases of that cycle. The first part of this cycle is called the follicular phase. follicular phase. Okay. The last part of this cycle is called the luteal phase. And in day 14 is an event, that's ovulation, okay? So at day 14, you have ovulation, which is not a phase, it is an event. Okay. So the follicular phase is also called the pre-ovulatory phase. The luteal phase is also called the post-ovulatory phase. So you have pre-ovulation, ovulation, post-ovulation. Follicular, ovulation, luteal. Okay, so now let's just put a little blurb with each of those to say what happens during that. What's the big deal about each of these phases? So the follicular phase, like you can imagine, we are going to mature follicles during the follicular phase. We're going to mature follicles. So what that means is we can have primordials can start maturing into primaries. Primaries can be maturing into secondary follicles. Secondary follicles can mature into tertiary follicles, also called mature or Brockian follicles. Okay? You can't go from a primordial to a tertiary in 1 month. You can't do it in 2 months. It takes about 9 months to a year to get all the way from a primordial to a tertiary. And it's only during the follicular phase that follicles can mature. Once ovulation happens, wherever they got to, that's where they stop or they're halted. Until the next month, they'll just pick up wherever they left off. Okay? So follicles can only mature during this follicular phase. Okay? Ovulation. Ovulation is where we're going to have a perfect sized tertiary or mature or Brockian follicle will rupture and release secondary oocyte that's halted at metaphase 2 that will be released from that follicle on the ovary into the fallopian tube. Hopefully it goes into the fallopian tube. Could end up in the abdominopelvic cavity, but usually it goes in the fallopian tube. Okay, then the luteal phase. Okay, the luteal phase, we're going to form what's called a corpus luteum. And I'm going to abbreviate that as CO, the corpus luteum. Okay? So what's a corpus luteum? Okay? So when we have that tertiary follicle rupture, okay? When that tertiary follicle ruptures, again, it's in the ovary, that tertiary follicle is in the ovary. It's on the surface of the ovary. So when it ruptures, most of that tertiary follicle, that rupture, most of it just stays there in the ovary. But some of the cells of that tertiary follicle go with that ovulated oocyte. And those are those barriers that we said a sperm cell has to break down so that one sperm can get in there and fertilize that egg. Right? Let me say it again. If we look at our follicles, here's a primary, a secondary, a tertiary. When that tertiary, or it's also called a vesicular follicle, when that tertiary mature Brockian follicle, also called a vesicular follicle, when it ruptures, right, you can see that some of the cells, here's your secondary oocyte halted at metaphase 2. Some of those follicular cells go with that ovulated oocyte. You can see those cells around there are part of that follicle. They go with that ovulated oocyte. Those are the cells that the sperm have to break down to get into that secondary oocyte. But most of this tertiary follicle that ruptured, most of it's still in the ovary, okay? Most of it's on the ovary. And some of those tertiary follicular cells that ruptured, some of them turn into this thing called a corpus luteum. Okay, so the corpus luteum is an endocrine structure, meaning that it's going to make hormones, an endocrine structure that is formed from ruptured tertiary follicular cells that are on the ovary or in the ovary. That's the corpus luteum. So I'm going to show you what it looks like here, and then we'll come back to this. Okay, so here's a cross section of the ovary. You can see that your follicles are always out here at the surface. Okay, you can look at an ovary, and assuming that a female has not been on birth control pills for, most of her life, most of her childbearing years, you can tell, you can get an idea of the age of a female based on how pitted the ovary is. Every time a tertiary follicle ruptures, right here, so here's your tertiary follicle, there's your secondary oocyte halted at metaphase 2 with some cells around it that the sperm will eventually have to break down to get into that. But when this follicle ruptures, okay, when it ruptures and releases that ovulated oocyte, there's a little pit that forms on the surface of the ovary. So if you have an ovary that's really smooth, then that means that that female either was on birth control pills or some kind of birth control where she did not ovulate, or she hasn't had many ovulations at that point. If it's a very pitted ovary, then that means that she's ovulated a lot. If you look at these follicles here, you can see the little tiny ones are primordials. Primaries get a little bit bigger. Secondaries get even bigger. Here's a secondary. Tertiaries get even bigger. And again, we're going to end up with a perfect size tertiary that ruptures mid-cycle, and out will come an ovulated oocyte, secondary oocyte halted at metaphase 2 that will get swept up in the fallopian tubes. And these cells here from this ruptured tertiary follicle, they turn into this corpus luteum. So there's your corpus luteum. This becomes an endocrine structure. It's going to start making hormones. Okay? This corpus luteum is going to make hormones until, if there's a pregnancy, until we can form a placenta. Okay, we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, questions on anything that I've put up there so far? Okay. All right, let's keep going. So we've got our timeline. We know what phases and events are occurring when. We know a little bit about what's happening during those phases. Now we want to say what triggers these phases, right? They're just not going to magically happen. Something has to trigger them. So in order to do that, we want to map out our hormonal axis first. So let's do that. It's going to be just like we did with males. I'm going to put it here. We've got hypothalamus. We've got our anterior pituitary. And then we have our ovaries. I'm going to put also up here, I'm going to put the uterus. I'm going to put the endometrium of the uterus, which is the innermost part of the endometrium. And then we're going to put many other cells. So it's going to be real similar to males with one key difference. So coming out of the hypothalamus, we are going to have gonadotropin releasing hormone. Gonadotropin releasing hormone is going to travel through the bloodstream. It's going to go to the anterior pituitary, tell the anterior pituitary to make FSH and LH. FSH and LH are going to come to the ovaries. FSH and LH are going to, drive the ovarian cycle, which is what we're mapping out right here, and we'll see exactly what FSH and LH do in this cycle in just a second. What we're gonna see is that as FSH and LH are influencing this cycle, it's gonna cause estrogen and progesterone to be made from the ovaries, and we'll see exactly where it's made in just a minute. Okay? So estrogen and progesterone are gonna come out of the ovaries. Estrogen and progesterone. Okay? Now, estrogen and progesterone go to many cells, and they do lots of things. So, for example, estrogen and progesterone can help with development and maturation of reproductive structures, can influence central nervous system development, so brain development. Estrogen can influence osteoblasts. It can cause bones to grow, so put increase in bone density. Okay, that's estrogen. And lots of other things, okay? Lots of other things that we're not gonna write out there. Estrogen and progesterone also come to the uterus. And estrogen and progesterone are going to trigger and drive the uterine cycle, okay? So estrogen and progesterone trigger the uterine cycle, which is also called the menstrual cycle. And we'll talk about that one next, okay? That one's pretty straightforward cycle. It's pretty easy. Okay, estrogen and progesterone, like testosterone in males, will come up and inhibit the hypothalamus. But now we're gonna have something a little bit odd that happens, and that is estrogen, and only estrogen. I'm gonna put if estrogen reaches a high, I'm gonna put in parentheses threshold, or in quotes, threshold value. So if estrogen reaches this particularly high, what we're gonna call threshold value, then instead of being inhibitory at the hypothalamus, it becomes excitatory at the anterior pituitary. Okay, and we'll see how that works in just a second. Okay, progesterone doesn't do it, only estrogen does it. Okay? So normally, when estrogen progesterone levels rise, they inhibit the hypothalamus. But if estrogen keeps rising, and we'll see how it can do that, estrogen keeps rising, then instead of being inhibitory, once it reaches this real high value, all of a sudden it starts exciting the anterior pituitary. Okay, so normally estrogen and progesterone inhibit the hypothalamus when the levels rise, but if and when estrogen reaches this particularly high value, then it can excite the anterior pituitary. Okay, let's come back to this now. And let me put this back up here. Okay, so what triggers this whole thing? What triggers this whole thing is a rise in what hormone? Follicle stimulating hormone. So a rise in FSH is going to trigger this cycle. Now, I want you to look at this, okay? This is where the levels are low, and this is where they get high. And we're not talking about huge differences between here and here. But it gets high enough that it starts, follicles to start maturing. Okay? Now, I want you to also keep in mind that whatever FSH does, LH is also doing, right? So if FSH is rising, LH is also rising, but LH does not trigger the follicles to start maturing, okay? LH does not trigger the follicles to start maturing, only FSH does, even though they both rise together. And that's because the follicles have receptors for FSH at this point. And as these follicles are maturing, what are these follicles starting to produce? Actually, yeah, let's talk about that. What are those follicles starting to produce? What do we write up here? We said fecal and granulosal cells start making what? Estrogens, okay? So as these follicles are maturing, as we get primaries and secondaries and tertiaries, they start having specialized cells, fecal and granulosal cells, and those make estrogen, okay? So during this follicular phase, we're gonna see estrogen levels rise. So I'm gonna put down here, during this follicular phase, we see a rise in estrogen. Now, the other thing I do when I go to study this stuff is I always think, why are these hormones rising or falling, okay? So let's talk about estrogen for a second, and then we'll talk about FSH, okay? So estrogen. Estrogen is rising during this phase, okay? Because estrogen's rising because it's coming from developing, not primordials, but it's from primary, secondary, and tertiary follicles. As soon as we get to the point of having primary, secondary, and tertiaries, they have fecal granulosal cells that can make estrogen, okay? Primordials don't have those. That's why I didn't put primordials in here. It's primaries, secondaries, and tertiaries that have the fecal and granulosal cells. I'm gonna put that in parentheses. Fecal and granulosal cells. They're the ones that are making estrogen. Now, let's back up for just a second and think about how did FSH rise in the first place, okay? What happened to make FSH rise to start this whole thing? So before estrogen levels started to rise, okay, before anything happened, say I didn't write this up here yet, what caused FSH levels to start to rise? And that's where you have to come over here and kind of think your way through it. FSH levels rised because what hormone rised to cause that to get higher? GnRH. Okay, so FSH got higher because GnRH got higher. Then we say, well, what caused GnRH to get higher to trigger this new cycle? GnRH got higher because it was being more or less inhibited. Less inhibited, which means that GnRH was able to get high because we had more or less estrogen and progesterone around. We had less, okay? So what happened here was something caused estrogen and progesterone levels to drop out here, which then made the hypothalamus less inhibited, which allowed GnRH levels to go up, which caused FSH to go up, and now we start a new cycle, okay? So we're gonna see estrogen and progesterone, we're gonna look at it at the end of this cycle. Because whatever caused this one to start is gonna be the same thing that happens at the end of this one before we start a new one. Okay, so we're gonna see that here. Okay, so that's how we got FSH high, okay, or elevated. Okay, so again, FSH went up, that caused follicles to start maturing. We have primordials maturing towards primaries, primaries maturing towards secondaries, secondaries maturing towards tertiaries. And once you get under the influence of FSH, once you get primaries, secondaries, and tertiaries, those fecal and granulosal cells will be making estrogen. That's where our estrogen comes from. All right, now, estrogen is going to reach a really high value here. Okay, this is when we get that really high value being produced. Okay, so I'm gonna put an asterisk here, and we're gonna say estrogen will reach that high threshold value where it becomes excitatory at the anterior pituitary. It's only gonna happen during this phase, okay? It's only when those follicles are maturing, it's towards the end of that follicular cycle that estrogen can start to reach that really high value. Okay? And so then what's gonna happen is, when estrogen reaches that high value, it's going to excite the anterior pituitary. And when the anterior pituitary gets excited, that's when we see this huge spike here. So you can see estrogen levels are rising, 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 because follicles are maturing, maturing, maturing. Estrogen is gonna reach a really high value, and when it reaches that high value, it's gonna stimulate the anterior pituitary, and that's gonna cause what's called the surge in luteinizing hormone. That huge amount of luteinizing hormone is because estrogen reaches that really high value here that stimulates the anterior pituitary. Okay, so this results in, so we can put this, is gonna cause a surge in luteinizing hormone. And it's that surge in luteinizing hormone, that's what triggers ovulation. The surge in luteinizing hormone triggers ovulation. So this is due to a huge increase, which we're calling a surge, in LH. So FSH also goes up, but FSH is not going to cause ovulation. The surge in luteinizing hormone causes ovulation. So on your test, if I were asking you questions about, well, obviously I'm going to ask you questions about this, but if I say, what hormone directly triggers ovulation, what are you going to tell me? What hormone directly causes ovulation?
Estrogen?
Directly causes it. LH. Right? If I say what caused LH to get so high, that's when you then can tell me the estrogen. But estrogen by itself doesn't cause this, okay? Estrogen by itself can't cause ovulation. Estrogen can stimulate the anterior pituitary. That causes the surge in luteinizing hormone. That then targets that tertiary follicle and causes it to rupture. LH does. Okay, so now, up here, we now have a secondary oocyte halted at metaphase 2, that's in the fallopian tube. On the ovary, we now are starting to form this corpus luteum, okay? That corpus luteum is an endocrine structure, okay? This corpus luteum is gonna start to make estrogen and progesterone, but mostly progesterone. So I'm gonna put here, during this luteal phase, you're gonna see a rise in progesterone. And I'm gonna put in parentheses, and some estrogen. If I ask you, what is the primary hormone produced during the luteal phase? You're gonna tell me progesterone, right? I want you to look at here. So the luteal phase, that's this part, the second part. When you look at the second part of the cycle, you can see progesterone levels go up. Estrogen's still up there. Estrogen never gets as high as it did during the follicular phase, but progesterone starts skyrocketing. Okay. So estrogen's still being produced from the corpus luteum, not from follicles. Estrogen's being produced from the corpus luteum, but mostly it's progesterone. Okay. Progesterone and some estrogen are being produced from the developing corpus luteum. All right, So now what we're gonna say is, if we have fertilization, if a sperm fertilizes that secondary oocyte halted at metaphase 2, okay? If we have fertilization, then the corpus luteum will remain. Meaning it won't die, it'll stick around, okay? If we have fertilization, the corpus luteum will stay there. The corpus luteum will remain until we can form a placenta. Okay? That parentheses, until we can form a placenta, which takes about 3 months. Once we have a placenta, then the placenta can produce hormones for us, okay? But until that time, we need the corpus luteum to do it, okay? So if fertilization occurs, corpus luteum is gonna stick around there in the ovary and produce hormones. So that means if we keep the corpus luteum, then our estrogen and our progesterone levels stay high or they stay low. Do they stay high or low? If
Low.
we keep the corpus luteum.
They're gonna go low.
They stay high, right? Because the corpus luteum is making progesterone and some estrogen. So if the corpus luteum sticks around,
Oh,
then it's still making progesterone and estrogen. Okay?
see.
So if the corpus luteum sticks around, estrogen, progesterone levels stay high, right? Right, but I'm gonna put in parentheses, but estrogen never reaches that high threshold value. Where it's excitatory here. It cannot do it. It can only do it during the follicular phase. That's the only time estrogen can get that high. So estrogen, progesterone levels are gonna stay elevated if we have fertilization because the corpus luteum stays and it will keep making estrogen and progesterone levels high, but not crazy high, until placenta can take over and then it will do it. The placenta will make estrogen and progesterone. But we'll never reach that high excitatory estrogen value during the luteal phase, ever. It just does not happen. Corpus luteum will never make that much estrogen. And you can see here, we make estrogen, but it never gets as high as it did during the follicular phase. So what does that mean then? If estrogen and progesterone levels stay high, then that means the hypothalamus is more or less inhibited. If estrogen and progesterone levels stay high, is the hypothalamus more or less inhibited?
More.
More, okay, so the hypothalamus is gonna be more inhibited. And if the hypothalamus is more inhibited, then what's gonna happen to GnRH levels? Will they stay high or low? Low, so GnRH stays low, not 0, but low. And if GnRH levels stay low, what happens to FSH and LH levels? They stay low. And FSH staying low prevents a new ovarian cycle, right? We don't want to start a new ovarian cycle if we have a pregnancy, right? You don't want to ovulate all over again while you have a pregnancy. So if you have a pregnancy, you stay in this cycle. You don't start a new one. So it's absolutely critical during a pregnancy that progesterone levels stay high, okay? To keep all this inhibited. Estrogen too, but really progesterone is gonna be real important. That's also why if estrogen and progesterone levels stay high, morning sickness often occurs because you're not used to having estrogen and progesterone levels stay that high for that long. Usually, they drop at this point, okay? We're gonna look at that next. So let's say if there's no fertilization, let's look at that one. If if there's no fertilization. Okay, if there's no fertilization, then the corpus luteum will die. Okay, corpus luteum is programmed to die unless there's a zygote that releases a chemical. Corpus luteum is designed to die unless unless the zygote forms and releases a chemical. Okay. So the corpus luteum will die about 12 to 14 days after it starts forming. After it starts to form. And if we look at that, if it starts forming around day 15, then it's going to start dying around day 28, 26, 27, 28. Okay? So it's going to die around day 26 to around day 28 if there's no fertilization. Okay? So it starts forming here. It's going to die here 12 to 14 days if there's no fertilization. And if it dies, what's going to happen to estrogen and progesterone levels? They're going to plummet, right? If it dies, estrogen and progesterone levels are going to drop because the corpus luteum is making the estrogen and progesterone. So if it dies, boom, there goes your levels of estrogen and progesterone. And if estrogen and progesterone levels drop, then what happens to your hypothalamus? Is it more or less inhibited? It's less inhibited. And when your hypothalamus is less inhibited, what happens to your GnRH levels? They're going to go up. And when your GnRH levels go up, what happens to your FSH and LH levels?
Go up.
They're going to go up. And it's the rise in FSH that starts a new ovarian cycle. Okay? We just keep doing the whole thing all over again. Okay? So, birth control, right? I want you to think about it, okay? I want you to think about how birth control works, but essentially, I'm going to tell you this, give you some hints, and let you think about it, okay? The best way to keep from getting pregnant is to not ovulate. That's the best way to keep from getting pregnant, okay? Not to not have sex. So I'm joking. But it's to not ovulate, right? It's to not ovulate. So if you don't ovulate, you can't get pregnant. The way that you avoid ovulation is you never let that surge in LH happen. And you avoid the surge in LH by never letting estrogen reach that high threshold value, right? And you never let estrogen reach that high threshold value by just keeping the hypothalamus inhibited. Keep the hypothalamus inhibited, GnRH levels stay low, FSH and LH levels stay low, and you don't start a new cycle. Don't start a new cycle, you can't ovulate. So birth control works on that, right? You take a little bit of estrogen and or progesterone, just enough to keep your hypothalamus inhibited. So your GnRH levels stay low, your FSH and LH levels stay low, and you never start a new cycle. You essentially trick your body into thinking that it's, I always hate it when people say, trick your body into thinking it's pregnant. Kind of, right? Kind of, but not really. In this sense, yes. You're tricking your body into not starting a new cycle. Right? That's what we're thinking. Okay. Questions on that stuff? Okay. I know you probably may not even know what to ask yet. Once you do this a couple times, it really makes a nice story that leaps on itself. Okay? You just walk through it very methodically like this. Do your timeline, do your phases, write in a little blurb about what's happening during the phases. What triggers the phase? Why is it high? Why is it low? What do you get from that phase? So what triggers the ovarian cycle are your gonadotropins, the hormones that come from the anterior pituitary. What comes out of the ovarian cycle is estrogen and progesterone, okay? That's gonna trigger the uterine cycle. That's what we're doing next, okay? Okay, I'm gonna erase this, take a drink of water, and we're gonna do the uterine cycle in 30 minutes so we can get upstairs and do our slides. So, just a couple things before we get to the uterus. This is just talking about the fallopian tubes. You don't need to know the different parts of the fallopian tube, don't worry about it, okay? So the infundibulum, the ampulla. I just want you to know the fimbriae that wrap around, that drape over the ovary. That's what I want you to know, the fimbriae. So I want you to know about the fallopian tubes, but you don't need to know the different parts except for the fimbriae, okay? I want you to know the fallopian tube is where fertilization is going to occur. I want you to know the fallopian tube is what the ovulated oocyte is swept up into. I want you to know that the zygote forms in the fallopian tube. Okay, all that happens in the fallopian tube. And then once you have a zygote, it will start undergoing mitosis, moving through the fallopian tube towards the uterus, hopefully towards the uterus. Okay. There is nothing on here that I will ask you about on your test. Okay? This is just telling you how long it takes for the oocyte to travel through the fallopian tube to the uterus. We talked about the fact that prior to ovulation, your cilia will start beating, and you've got peristaltic waves due to the muscle in the fallopian tube. Just helps the cells move, the oocyte move. The sperm can stick around for a couple days because the fallopian tubes are releasing nutrients, and the sperm can use that to live for a few days. But again, there's nothing on there that I'm going to ask you on your test. All right, the uterus. So the uterus is a hollow organ. It is a thick-walled organ. Okay? There are connective tissues that hold the uterus in place. Up in lab, on your practical, I will ask you about the uterosacral and the round ligaments. Not the cardinal ligaments, you don't have to worry about those. The uterosacral, those are just ligaments that come off of the lateral side of the uterus and anchor posteriorly into the sacrum. They come off the lateral side of the uterus and they anchor posteriorly into the sacrum. The uterosacral, their job is to hold the uterus posteriorly so it can't rock forward. Okay? It's kind of like anchoring it back like this so it can't move forward. That's real important when you have a kicking fetus in there. Okay? You don't want it moving around. The uterus moving around too much. The round ligaments, okay, they kind of do just the opposite. They come off laterally and then they come anteriorly and anchor into the connective tissue of the external genitalia. So they anchor anteriorly. They come off lateral and anchor down here. The round ligaments are holding the uterus anteriorly so it can't rock posteriorly. Okay? So between the two, you basically have ropes holding uterosacral, holds the uterus posteriorly. The round ligaments are holding the uterus anteriorly so it can't rock back and forth. Okay? And on the practical, I'll just ask you with words. I'll say, what's the name of the ligaments that come off the lateral side of the uterus and anchor into the external genitalia? You can say round ligaments, okay? Or I might say, I might also add they restrict posterior movement, something like that. Okay? Uterosacral, I'll just say, what's the ligaments that come off the lateral side of the uterus that anchor into the sacrum? They restrict anterior movement, okay? Uterosacral, right there the name tells you. It goes off the lateral side of the uterus, goes to the sacrum, uterosacral ligaments. And the broad ligament keeps it from moving side to side. What you don't want is you don't want that uterus flipping, okay? That happens and it's really dangerous. Cuts off blood supply, the tissue of the uterus and the fetus can die pretty easily if something like that were to happen. Okay, 3 layers to the uterus. Outermost layer, just connective tissue that goes around the organs, called the perimetrium. This is a serous membrane, just like we saw around the heart and around the lungs. It's also called the visceral peritoneum, okay? Same basic template that we've seen on Porter now. Perimetrium or the visceral peritoneum, it's just connective tissue that goes around the uterus. The majority of the uterus is the middle layer. That's the myometrium. It's layers and layers and layers of smooth muscle. These are the smooth muscle cells that contract under the influence of oxytocin, right, and other hormones during labor and delivery. The innermost layer is the endometrium. That's what we're going to talk about. It's the endometrium that changes during the uterine cycle under the influence of estrogen and progesterone. Okay, so I'm going to erase this stuff. I don't want to erase that. We will erase this. Okay, and then I'm going to erase this. This. And keep that up there. And then I'm going to put, just so we remember that during this, I'm going to put an increase in estrogen. And then during this, I'm going to get rid of that. An increase in progesterone and some estrogen. Okay. We're going to keep that and put the uterine cycle underneath it so we can see how they line up. Okay, so it's the endometrium that changes over the course of the month. During menses, all but the deepest layers of the endometrium slough off. That's what menses are, okay? Okay. For this cycle, the uterine cycle. Uterine cycle, I'll change the marker here in just a second. Also the menstrual cycle. Okay, we're gonna do the same thing. We're gonna map out a timeline. We're gonna put in the dates, the phases, say a little blurb about each phase, what hormone triggers it. This one's nice and simple, okay? So we're gonna do a standard 28-day cycle. 0 to 28. I'm gonna put day 14 on there. Okay. So for the uterine cycle, we've got 3 phases instead of 2 that we had in the ovarian cycle. The 3 phases are, the first part of that cycle is menses. Okay, it's around days 1 to 5. Now obviously that varies from person to person. All right, we're gonna put day 1. Day 5, okay, that's menses. Second part of this cycle is day 6 to 14, called the proliferative phase. Day 6 to day 14, the proliferative phase. If I choose the uterine cycle for you to fill out, I would say something like days 1 to 5 is what phase, right? So make sure you know the phases, the names of them, okay? You would say menses. 6 to 14, you say proliferative, and so on and so forth, okay? Then you've got day 15, day 28, secretory phase. And again, these days can shift a little bit, okay? All right, so now we're gonna say what happens, a little blurb about what happens in each of these phases. Remember, the uterine cycle is all about the endometrium, okay? The innermost part of the uterus, the endometrium. So menses is where the endometrium, all but the deepest layer, the endometrium sloughs off. Sloughs does not have an F in it, okay? Sloughs. sloughs off. I don't know if it has an E in it. I'm gonna put it E. Sloughs off, okay? Basically flakes off, okay? All but the deepest layer of that layer of the uterus sloughs off, okay? So what's gonna come out? Blood, as blood vessels are spasming, rupturing, and a lot of tissue, okay? That's what's gonna come off. Sloughs off. Okay? The proliferative phase is when your endometrium starts to rebuild. Basically what that means is the cells that were left behind, they're dividing and differentiating. It's getting thicker, okay? So it starts to rebuild, it gets thicker. Cells are dividing. Cells are dividing, okay? The secretory phase, okay? This is where the endometrium is getting ready for possible implantation. Just in case we have fertilization up here in the fallopian tube, the uterus has to be ready for implantation, just in case. So the secretory phase, we're gonna say the endometrium prepares for implantation. Okay, but what I will also say is, if I were to ask you this, to fill this out as your table, and that's all that you tell me, I'm gonna take at least a half a point off, maybe a whole point. Because I'm gonna say, what does that mean? Okay, really the whole thing is preparing for implantation. Okay, I'm gonna say, what does this mean? What this means is, the endometrium continues to get thicker, continues to increase in thickness. And again, that's because cells are dividing. And here's the key thing that separates it from the proliferative phase. And we start producing secretions from newly formed secretory glands. So part of this secretory phase, which is how it gets its name, is you're producing secretory glands and they start producing secretions. So not only is the layer getting thicker, but now we're secreting nutrients. In case there is implantation, we've got lots of nutrients available for those cells that might implant. Okay, so now we want to say what triggers these, okay? What triggers this? So again, remember, what drives the uterine cycle, okay? So again, if I ask you this on the test, you're gonna write this up here, because people miss this all the time, and there's no reason to miss it. Okay, right here. Okay, so your anterior pituitary hormones, right, FSH and LH, drive the ovarian cycle. Okay, your ovarian hormones estrogen and progesterone drive the uterine cycle. Okay? So what's going to cause all these phases is directly changes in estrogen and progesterone. Okay? So if I were to ask you one of these, and I will ask you one of these to fill out, don't start telling me about the other one. Okay, just focus on the one I'm asking you about. So if I ask you about the uterine cycle, you should never tell me about FSH and LH, okay? FSH and LH work at the ovary, okay? What works at the endometrium is estrogen and progesterone, okay? I don't care about FSH and LH at that point. This is what I'm asking you about. So again, let's think our way through here, okay? I'm going to come back to menses in a minute, okay? So, actually, let's come up here for a second, okay? Okay, so let's do an ovarian cycle and then we'll link it all together. Okay, so up at the ovaries, we see this rise in FSH, follicles start to mature. That means estrogen is gonna start being produced. Estrogen reaches that really high level, and that causes that surge in luteinizing hormone, which then causes ovulation. Okay? By the time that we hit ovulation, if we were to look down here in the uterus, we are at this point getting ready to transition from the proliferative to the secretory phase. Okay? Up in the ovary, during the luteal phase, we're producing a corpus luteum, progesterone, and some estrogens being produced. And again, if we look down here in the endometrium, it's getting thicker and thicker and thicker and thicker, just in case we have fertilization up here. But let's say we don't have fertilization, okay? Let's say we don't have fertilization here. We said if there's no fertilization, then the corpus luteum is gonna die, progesterone and estrogen levels will drop. And when progesterone and estrogen levels drop, that causes the hypothalamus to be less inhibited, GnRH goes up, FSH goes up, and then we'll start a new ovarian cycle. If we look at this though, also, if the corpus luteum dies, okay, we've got this nice thick endometrium at this point, okay? If the corpus luteum dies, this nice thick endometrium, we don't need anymore, okay? When the corpus luteum dies and progesterone and estrogen drop, that drop in progesterone is gonna cause this nice thick endometrium that we have, it's gonna slough off. And that's what starts a new uterine cycle, okay? So what starts this new cycle is a drop in progesterone. So again, I always write, why is progesterone dropping? Progesterone is dropping from the corpus luteum at the ovary dying because we had no fertilization. That's why our progesterone levels dropped. That drop in progesterone, that's what causes the sloughing of that endometrium. Right? So we already said that progesterone dropping and the estrogen dropping too will ultimately cause FSH to rise. Hypothalamus less inhibited, GnRH levels rise, FSH rises, and now we're starting a new ovarian cycle. What's gonna trigger this proliferative phase is right around day 6, if we look up here in the ovary, we're producing enough estrogen by day 6 that it triggers the endometrium to start to rebuild. So right here, at day 6, that's due to the proliferative phase. That's due to a rise in estrogen. And again, that estrogen is coming from developing primary, secondary, and tertiary follicles at the ovary. Up here in the ovary, estrogen's gonna reach that really high value. It's gonna cause that, stimulate the anterior pituitary. That's gonna cause the surge in luteinizing hormone. We're gonna have ovulation up there. Corpus luteum's gonna start to form, and at day 15, as this corpus luteum just starts forming and producing progesterone, that's what triggers the secretory phase. So this is due to a rise in progesterone. And again, that progesterone is coming from the developing corpus luteum. So let's just write this out here, okay? So we're gonna say if no fertilization, corpus luteum is gonna remain. It's not gonna die. Oh, no, sorry. if there's no fertilization, the corpus luteum dies. Sorry about that. Corpus luteum dies. It's gonna die about 12 to 14 days after it starts forming. Which puts us around day 26 to day 28, something like that. When the corpus luteum dies, progesterone levels and estrogen levels will drop. That drop in progesterone, that's gonna trigger a new uterine cycle. That drop in progesterone triggers a new uterine cycle, okay? The drop in progesterone and the drop in estrogen will cause the hypothalamus to be less inhibited. Hypothalamus being less inhibited is gonna cause GnRH levels to rise. That's gonna cause FSH levels to rise and LH. It's that rise in FSH that will start a new ovarian cycle. Do the whole thing all over again. It's right over here, just to follow it through. If you do have fertilization, then the corpus luteum remains. That zygote will produce a chemical that causes that corpus luteum to not die. That corpus luteum will remain until a placenta forms. And then the placenta will take over producing these pregnancy hormones. It takes about 3 months. If the corpus luteum remains, and also when we have a placenta, what we'll see is progesterone levels are gonna stay up, and estrogen will stay up, but not too high. We won't stimulate the anterior pituitary. Okay? We'll never get that high with estrogen. Having progesterone staying elevated, that's gonna prevent a new uterine cycle, which is good because if that progesterone were to drop, if it drops any time during this pregnancy, then this nice thick endometrium, where we will ultimately have a growing embryo and fetus, it will slough off and you will have a miscarriage, okay? So you cannot let progesterone levels drop during that pregnancy at all, because the endometrium would slough off. And anything that implanted in there would be sloughed right with it. Okay, so that increase in progesterone keeps the new uterine cycle from starting. So we keep a nice thick endometrium for that whole pregnancy. And both of these here is gonna keep the hypothalamus more inhibited. That's gonna keep GnRH levels low. That's gonna keep FSH levels low and LH. And the low FSH is gonna prevent a new ovarian cycle. So when you go to study this, start with the ovarian cycle first, map it out, okay? And when you go to study this, I literally would do it just like we did in lecture. I would do oogenesis first, just learn the cells, how you get the cells being produced, what gets ovulated, when all that stuff happens. Then think about your follicles, then put your cycle together, be comfortable with your ovarian cycle, and then you can add in the uterine cycle. Do that a couple times and you'll be okay. On your practical for gametogenesis, I told you how I'd ask you some questions about spermatogenesis. These are the kinds of questions I'll ask you for female gametogenesis. So I might say, for oogenesis, what cell is ovulated? And you would tell me that is a what cell? not primary, but a secondary, okay? A secondary what? Oocyte, secondary oocyte that's halted at metaphase
2.
2. Okay, good. If I said females are born with ovum, true or false?
True. False.
False. Females are not born with ovum. How do you get an ovum? Only if your ovulated cell gets what? Fertilized. Okay. I'm not gonna ask you true, false questions, but I just wanted to give you a push there. Okay. I don't like true, false questions. A primary oocyte is diploid or haploid? Diploid, okay? It's the it's your oogonia that's diploid, your primary oocyte that's diploid, your secondary oocyte's haploid, and your ovum is haploid. So you got 2 diploid, 2 haploid. Let me ask you one more and then we'll stop. Actually, there's a couple more things I wanna say, but just like 5 minutes, we're done. Which follicle ruptures upon ovulation? Tertiary, or you could call it a mature, or you could call it a graphian. So those are the kinds of questions I'll be asking you, okay? Most of that will be on your practical. There'll be a few things on your lecture exam relevant to this, but straight up just the metagenesis, I'll ask you on the practical. Okay. Menarche and menopause. I'm not going to ask you anything about this on your test. You should read through it though, it's interesting. Menarche is just your first cycle. Menopause is the termination of your uterine cycle. If you have certain illnesses, you lose a lot of weight, you're very stressed, you can have an interruption in that cycle. Vagina. We're going to look at histology of the vagina. One thing I definitely want you to know, I absolutely will ask you about. The vagina is the only reproductive structure, males or females, that has stratified squamous epithelia. Toughest, most durable epithelia to deal with not only copulation, but to also deal with the fact that it's a passageway for birth, menstrual flow, and it's the organ of copulation. You need that epithelium to be strong, tough, durable. We've already talked about the fact that there are an endogenous natural flora of bacteria that reside there. We want them there. They're supported by nutrients in the cervical mucus. Their metabolic activity creates an acidic environment that helps to restrict growth of other pathogens and inhibits the sperm's survival. Sperm get around that by buffers, okay? They can get around that. We've already talked about external genitalia. We talked about our hormones already. This is just looking at some more details about hormones. I'm gonna ask you only what we talked about here. Okay, so like I'm not gonna ask you this. Anything on there that we did not talk about, you do not need to worry about. This is just redundancy in what we've talked about already. Once you go through all of this, this is a good slide right here to look at to make sure you understand what's going on. This is looking at the ovarian cycle, hormones that drive the ovarian cycle, coming out of the ovarian cycle, these hormones that drive the uterine cycle. You should pick a couple points on here and make sure they make sense to you. Then you'll know you know it well. Lastly, let me say one thing about inhibin, okay? Inhibin is a hormone that is produced from your follicles, okay? Inhibin works like estrogen and progesterone to inhibit the hypothalamus. It's just another way of trying to keep levels, to keep a negative feedback loop going, okay, at least for part of the cycle. Your corpus luteum also can produce inhibin as well. Again, it works with estrogen and progesterone and inhibin to inhibit the hypothalamus in the anterior pituitary. While you have a corpus luteum, you want to keep GnRH, FSH, and LH levels low while you have estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin. Okay, that's it. No development on the final, okay? I'm going to go open up the lab I need to take a couple minute break to get some water.